Welcome back to the program. Well, just before the break, we were talking about Greece and obviously the impact it's been having on markets, not just our own regionally, and now, of course, what we're seeing in the European session. It has certainly been the hot topic right through the weekend and through today. Well, joining us to discuss a little bit more on Greece, Paul Rickard from the Switzer Super Report, and also joining us live via Skype in Lemnos in Greece, the very own Peter Switzer. You can see him there on screen. And Peter, look, I might start with you. Great timing, firstly, in choice of holidays and holiday destinations. But over the weekend, when we got the announcement of the referendum, what sort of a mood, what sort of a reaction was there amongst the people?
Yeah, look, I think a lot of people thought it was a triumphant decision by the Prime Minister, Alexis Tsipras. He actually came up with what seems like an interesting political idea, but I think it was quickly trumped, when the Euro group of finance ministers, led by the German finance minister, basically said, well, we don't care what the referendum actually decides, that they will default on Tuesday, and that's the important issue.
Peter, it's good to see you again. The question for the referendum, I'll come back to some of the detail in a moment, but the question is basically to affirm a plan from the European Union. So for the Greeks to go their own way, they'd need to vote in the negative. That's correct, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. So if they vote yes, and by the way, the latest survey I've seen, 57% say they want to stay in the Eurozone, so they would effectively have to vote yes for that. And what's going to be really interesting, Paul and James, is over this week, the reality of going it alone and the implications are going to be felt. Like, as of today, I learned that the maximum you can get out from an ATM is 60 euros. That doesn't get you much. Banks are officially closed today. I'm sure they're negotiating with the Euro Central Bank to see if they can get more money in, because they've run out of cash. Everyone's drawing out their euros ahead of the possibility of them leaving the Eurozone. So the economic reality is starting to hit lots of people, particularly, I think, on the islands where they actually haven't cared so much about the issue. Certainly Athens, we've seen lots of protests there. And, of course, the job losses have centred on places like Athens and the other major cities around the country. But I think the whole country is now going to focus on it. It's going to be very interesting to see the way they go, because the Prime Minister is actually recommending people vote no.
And just going back to the actual question, I sort of downloaded, I think it's called a 10-point plan or something, and tried to understand exactly what they're voting on. And it's about a 5-page, most closely sort of typeset sort of proposal that I got to about page 2 and gave up and said, this is getting a bit tricky. Do the Greek people, you think, really know what they're voting about, or is it just a question more about we either want to stay in the euro, or we just got to say goodbye to sort of this austerity program? Do you think there's a widespread understanding of what the question's about?
No, definitely not. Definitely not. And it gets down to there'll be some people, the wealthier middle class, will be worried about seeing their wealth converted from euros to drachmas. That's going to be a very telling issue for the week, I think, when people start realising that. And given the fact they're not allowing people to withdraw large amounts, they're basically stuck with the decision of the referendum. A lot of people also are holding the Germans responsible for the severe austerity. I found a chart which I use on my blog this morning on switzer.com.au. And James, you'd be staggered to see that the primary budget position of Greece is actually a 5% surplus when you adjust it for the cyclical or how fast or how slow it's growing. Because they're in recession and their level of taxation compared to government spending, it actually adjusts to being a 5% primary budget surplus, which probably economically explains why the Greeks are really finding it hard. Unemployment is 25.8%. And I think just being reflected in the numbers, and I think a lot of people are saying to themselves, can we cope with being in the Eurozone any longer? Maybe we should go it alone.
Well, just on that, Peter, and it's certainly something that people are starting to talk more and more about here, and that is the idea of them just basically cutting their ties, leaving the common currency, going back to the drachma. Yes, there would be a lot of pain, hyperinflation, a bottoming out in terms of the currency, flow-on effects to unemployment and so forth. But longer term, it might attract business investment, tourism. There are certainly plus sides longer term for them perhaps leaving the Eurozone.
Yeah, I think that's the case. The reason is, I think the Greeks have this attitude that they're not for changing. It's a country full of Margaret Thatchers. I'm not going to change no matter what. And I also don't think they have the kind of leadership. See, Australia was in a fairly similar, not exactly, but in the 80s, we had large foreign debt. Our currency had fallen below 50 US cents. Our budget deficits were extraordinarily high. We had inflation and unemployment. And Keating and Hawke introduced programs of change. Then Costello and Howard came along. Greece lacks this kind of leadership to embark on real reform. And as a consequence, I just think they might be better off going through short-term pain, and eventually, as you say, a lower drachma will give them some competitive edge. I think tourism would increase because the Australian dollar would buy a lot more nights in Greek hotels and isles and things like that. But the way they're going now, they just really are trying to blame everybody else but themselves, and I just don't think that's the recipe for economic success.
Just roll ahead a bit, Peter. Your sense, I suppose the first deadline is now Tuesday when, I think as Martin was saying earlier, technically it's a default but may not be called a default. When we sort of wake up on Wednesday and nothing's happened, do you think it's sort of game on, or are we just sort of going to be like this for the next week until we get through the referendum and sort of see what happens next Monday? I
think it's going to be really interesting to see how Wall Street reacts. Wall Street will obviously go down. I don't think they'll overreact. I think they're probably even more interested in their jobs number on Friday. Interestingly, Christine Lagarde said that they will default on Tuesday, but if they vote to stay in the Eurozone on Sunday, we might be able to help. So she's left the door open, effectively. If they want to stay in the Eurozone, they might be able to help. And I think that's one good thing. Also, Yanis Varoufakis, the finance minister, who used to teach economics at Sydney University, he said over the weekend that this is not over until Tuesday. So there could be a surprise. Russia could come in. I'd be surprised if they did, but Russia has negotiated a gas pipeline deal with Greece. They will say, well, let's keep the Greeks in the game for a while. I personally wouldn't be lending the Greeks any money, but on the flip side, if Greece are going to be dependent on Russian gas for their power in the future, they may well have something over them. Look, the one thing for sure is that the drama will continue.
I think one of the biggest points you made today, Peter, was that Greece is only 0.2% of world GDP, and even Eurozone GDP, I think it's only about 2%. So really, it is just a bit of a pimple. I get a sense that maybe the markets will just have to, will calm down a little bit. I think we might already be seeing that in some early European trading, but certainly it sounds like this is going to continue for at least another week, and maybe this might just get kicked along for more months. We don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah, I will be very disappointed if the European Central Bank hasn't already worked out what is likely to happen if Greece defaults.
Absolutely.
And what they'll do is they'll increase their quantitative easing, basically. They will lean against it. And let's face it, they would have had the B plan if they couldn't get across the line. So I think they will actually smooth it out. But in the short term, with markets, if uncertainty comes, you sell first and ask questions later.
Paul, I might ask you, just in terms of some of the selling, a lot of it's been around the banks, although they have certainly come well off their lows, European markets. Contagion, it's something that's been spoken about a lot, and certainly was something that was considered going back a few years as a real risk. That risk, though, my understanding is has dramatically lessened.
Yeah, very, very much so, James. I mean, I think there's still a little bit of an issue, I think, with some of the the banks in Spain and Portugal, still a little bit of exposure, and some of them are off a little bit more tonight. So there's, I think some of the Spanish banks are down 5 or 6%, and a bit of the Portuguese banks. But look, the contagion is really much better contained, largely because most of the debt's now in the hands of the IMF or the European Central Bank. So sort of most of the private bondholders and others have got out, and most of the banks have potentially been recapitalised. So I think we are in a much better position than we were 2 or 3 years ago. In the last, well, maybe even less. I don't know how many Greek sort of crises we've had now, but one loses count. But I think we're in a much better position. I think, if anything, the markets are probably more likely to say, look, this is interesting, but not the end of the world, particularly if in Europe they just, step up on the money printing presses, which is Peter suggesting. Would not surprise me if the US just almost ignores it, but that'll obviously be proved by we see over the next few days. But I think people are going to look back on this and say it's probably just more likely a buying opportunity. But you never know, and so as Martin was saying earlier, you've got to manage your risk, and that's, I think as an investor you learn very quickly.
Pete, we're almost out of time, but just one last answer, hopefully from you. How does this play out? Does this, a lot of talk about kicking the can down the road, do you think that indeed does happen, or do you think this is potentially drawing a bit of a line in the sand in terms of Greece and its place within the Eurozone?
Okay, the Greek Prime Minister is telling the people to vote no. So, of course, it's a bit of a political play on his part. If they vote yes, well, he can say, well, to his colleagues in the Syriza party. And by the way, the Syriza party is made up of a coalition of a whole bunch of loony lefts, including the Communist Party and whatever. And so he's finding it hard to manage his own people. So if he publicly is saying vote no, but the people say yes, then it gives him a chance to say to his parliamentary colleagues, we have to listen to the people. If that's the case, then I think it's going to be a can-kicking exercise down the road. Europe will try and help accommodate them.